Welcome to another edition of Cranky Gun Reviews. I'm finally getting this Mossberg model 44US-D put back together. I did some work on the stock the other day. I basically took some quad-aught steel wool and went over the entire stock as much as I could, sanded off any light scratches that were on there, and just generally cleaned up the wood. And then I gave it 2 medium coats of Tung oil, which usually gives you kind of a more dull finish, but this must have had more of a varnish finish on it than I thought it did. The tung oil basically made this thing like super glossy and shiny, or maybe like a semi-gloss. It's not exactly what I wanted for the finish on the stock, but it looks really good. So I'm not going to mess with it. You know, it's good enough for me. It's good enough to seal the wood again, wood grains, and give it a little bit more life. You got to remember, this is from like the late 1940s. So this wood is pretty old, and again, I think it came out pretty good. So now that the stock has been completely done, I kind of wanted to go over and look at the internal components of this rifle and just wanted to show everybody how simple the functionality of this rifle is. So here's the stock and the main action, the chamber and everything like that all put together. Obviously, you can see the barrel, the bluing that I did. Again, I called it like bluaflage or camo blue. It's a little bit splotchy, but it's okay with me. This is the complete trigger assembly, and it basically has your safety lever on the back, which just interrupts the trigger. The trigger has a small leaf spring above it with a pivot pin, and then you basically have your little lever, which has a spring-loaded screw. That's what gives you your tension. The main screw that holds your magazine release or your magazine catch in there. Then you have your bolt assembly, which I'm not going to take apart, but it's very simple. You unscrew the end, and there's only like 4 pieces inside. Your rear sling swivel, a handful of screws, your front barrel band, your buttstock screws. This is the bottom plate for the mag well, and then your butt plate. I have a couple of fiber washers for spacers that I need, your trigger guard, and your forward sling swivel and your forward screw. Now, I didn't have the forward takedown screw for this, so I ended up having to make one. And one thing that I thought was a bit interesting is the bolt has an M5 stamped in it, and so does the receiver. So does that mean these parts are matched to the gun? Maybe it does. I'm not so sure. Now that I have the completed stock put back together, I put the butt plate back on with the screws. Again, that rear sling swivel. Got the trigger guard installed, and that magazine well plate, or whatever you want to call it, with the rear takedown screw. I got the front sling swivel plate mounted, and again, I have the takedown screw that I had to file down to fit. And again, the finish on this thing looks pretty good. The bluing on some of the internal components or the underside, that plate on the bottom, not great. I didn't really touch that. This is what the action looks like put back together with all the components, the trigger and everything. Again, it's a pretty simple setup. There's only 2 screws that hold the entire trigger assembly onto the action, and the sear is basically part of the trigger. So if you don't have enough tension on that trigger, when you close the bolt, the firing pin actually goes forward. So make sure you have enough attention on that screw. Now, after I got all this stuff put together, again, you can see on the bottom here, this little L bracket is the piece that holds the magazine in. And what I ended up having to do was put one of these fiber washers underneath that. So basically, it's the fiber washer, the L bracket, and then the screw that holds the trigger adjusting screw in place. And that raised that up. It gave me enough room that I had the room to put the magazine in and out. So I wanted to do some checks on the trigger pull on this thing because it feels really light to me, and I haven't really used my trigger gauge a lot. The first pull was 1 pound 10 ounces, and I do have a snap cap in here, so I'm not hurting the gun. Second pull was 1 pound 12.1 ounces, and going on to the third pull here. Third pull was 1 pound 12.8 ounces. And again, going on the last pull here, wanted to get an average of 4. The last pull was 1 pound 10.8 ounces. So an average of 1 pound 11.4 ounces. It is an extremely crisp trigger on this particular gun. Now, because I don't have the correct sights on this thing, I figured I was going to go with a scope. So I bought that scope mount that screws right into the receiver. And I bought one of these BSA Sweet 22 scopes. These come with a few turrets, so you can actually adjust the bullet compensation drop just by turning the turret. These are pretty good for rimfire guns. It had dovetail rings on it, which won't work on this receiver. So I dug through my parts bins and I found some sniper scope rings. They're not the lowest. They stick up a little bit more than I would have liked, especially since the scope mount on this is a little bit taller than I would have liked as well. But here's the finished product of the rifle. And I have to say, for a super budget gun, this was actually a really fun build, and I guarantee that this thing is going to shoot well. Again, all in, the rifle cost me $150, I think. The scope mount was around 35 bucks. The scope was around 70 bucks. So when you're all in, you got less than $250 into this thing, start to finish. The tung oil I had, and the rest of it was just some elbow grease to put into this. I can't wait to get this thing out to the range and shoot it. I really think it's going to be a fun shooter and it's going to be an accurate rifle. It does have that bull barrel. And again, now that it's all together, you can kind of see end to end what it looks like. The stock looks pretty good. It doesn't look like it's 80 plus years old. The trigger guard on this one, it is an original one and it's not broken. A lot of people hate those trigger guards because they tend to break and maybe they're not the most comfortable thing. I happen to like them with the finger grooves. You can see those inexpensive sniper scope rings that I have on this, and then that BSA Sweet 22 scope that I have. You can see again, that's the perma blue that I used on the barrel in the action, and those are the two additional turret knobs that you get with the BSA Sweet 22 scope. So this is going to be a great gun to take out there and shoot. Here again, you can see that bull barrel. I should measure it. I think it's probably around like a 900 diameter. I don't think it's quite an inch, but it's a pretty heavy barrel. Again, thanks for joining me on this build. It's been a fun one. It's one of those things that, again, you can take these old, decrepit, beat up rifles with a little bit of elbow grease, turn them into a much nicer rifle, and these probably are more accurate than what you could get for the same price in a store today. $250, $300, you're not going to be able to get a very high-end gun, but these, because they're old and they were well built in America, these really are great rifles to take out there and shoot. So thanks again for joining me on another edition of Cranky Gun Reviews. Support your two-way rights. Get out there and shoot. Make sure you're careful when you're out at the range. God bless America. And you remember, if someone asks you to give up some of your freedom for the greater good, remind them that freedom is the greater good. And one last thing I want to do before my video ends, I want to give a shout out to Revolver Roundup. If you guys like revolvers and you like mutton chops and you like dry humor, then I suggest you go check out Revolver Roundup. You got mutton chops here in the old aviator sunglasses, and you got the cameraman behind the camera doing what they do best, talking about revolvers and using their dry humor and fun to make YouTube a better place. So go check them out. Tell them Cranky Gun Review sent you, and let's pump up their channel as well. They're just getting started, and they deserve a lot more views than they have.
You got any? Ooh, we got some right here. Very nice. Shoot.